The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trading post, where desperate souls gathered to barter whatever they had left. It was 1887, and the frontier was unforgiving to those who couldn't adapt to its harsh realities. Munga. The weathered faces and calloused hands. A tragic scene was about to unfold that would haunt the memories of all who witnessed it. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way, we can keep bringing you more stories like this one, standing near the wooden porch of Mackenzie's trading post. A gaunt Apache man clutched a small bundle wrapped in a torn, faded blanket. His name was Running Bear, though the white settlers had stripped him of that dignity long ago, calling him simply Joe. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had lost everything: his land, his tribe's way of life, and now his hope. The bundle in his arms stirred slightly, revealing tiny fingers that grasped at nothing but air. Inside was his daughter, barely 6 months old, with the distinctive features of her Apache heritage. Her dark eyes, when they opened, held an innocence that seemed almost cruel in such a harsh world. Her mother had died in childbirth during the harsh winter, leaving Running Bear alone with a responsibility he felt incapable of fulfilling. "Please," he whispered to the trading post owner, a burly man named Mackenzie, who had seen his share of human misery. "I cannot feed her. I have nothing left." His English was broken, learned through painful necessity as his people were forced to adapt or perish. Mackenzie looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He'd witnessed many desperate acts in his years running the trading post, but this felt different. "Joe, you can't be serious about this. She's your blood." "My blood will die of hunger," Running Bear replied, his voice hollow. "Better she lives with food than dies with pride." The words seemed to tear something inside him as he spoke them. But starvation had a way of making impossible choices seem reasonable. The other patrons of the trading post had gathered around, their conversations dying to whispers. Among them stood a man who seemed to belong to the shadows rather than the harsh daylight. Tom Harrison was a lumberjack who had drifted down from the Montana territories, following work wherever the railroads needed timber. He was a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of swinging an axe and hauling logs. But it wasn't his physical presence that made people notice. Tomet was his silence. In a world where men boasted and argued and filled the air with their words, Tom spoke only when absolutely necessary. Some said it was because he had nothing worth saying. Others whispered that he had seen things that had taken his words away. Forever, Tom had been in town for 3 days, restocking supplies before heading to a new logging camp further north. He'd minded his own business, as he always did, until he heard the Apache man's desperate plea. How something about the scene pulled. At a place in his chest that he thought had died years ago, Running Bear held out the baby toward Mackenzie, who stepped back instinctively. $2, the Apache man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I ask. What's $2 so she can eat today, and maybe tomorrow?" The crowd fell completely silent. Even the horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment there, neighing and stamping reduced to nervous shifting. $2 the price of a decent meal or a night's lodging. The price this desperate father was asking for his daughter's life. Mackenzie shook his head. "I can't, Joe. I'm not in the business of buying children. That's not... that's not right." But desperation has a way of making the impossible seem like the only option. Running Bear looked around the crowd, his eyes pleading. "Someone, anyone, please." Tom watched from the edge of the group, his calloused hands clenched at his sides. He had enough money in his pocket to help, but he'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems usually led to nothing but heartache. He'd seen enough heartache for several lifetimes. The baby began to cry, a thin, weak sound that spoke of hunger and discomfort. The sound seemed to cut through the desert air like a knife. And several of the women in the crowd looked away, unable to bear it. Running Bear rocked the bundle gently, whispering words in Apache that the others couldn't understand, but the tenderness in his voice was universal. "She's hungry," he said to the crowd, switching back to English. "I have no milk to give her. No food to trade for milk. She will die if I keep her." An elderly woman stepped forward, her face lined with compassion. "Surely there's another way, son. Maybe the mission is 3 days' ride?" Running Bear interrupted. "She doesn't have 3 days?" Tom found himself studying the Apache man's face, seeing past the desperation to the love that was tearing him apart. This wasn't a man selling his child for profit or convenience. This was a father making the most agonizing sacrifice imaginable, because he believed it was the only way to save her life. The baby's cries grew weaker, and that somehow made them even more heartbreaking. Running Bear's hand shook as he held her, and tears, the first Tom had seen from him, began to roll down his weathered cheeks. $2? He repeated, his voice breaking. "Just $2, and she lives?" That's when Tom did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his boots making heavy sounds on the wooden porch. The group parted to let him through. Sensing something significant was about to happen, Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Without counting, without hesitation, he placed $2 silver in Running Bear's outstretched palm. The Apache man looked up at him with eyes filled with gratitude and unbearable sorrow. "You will care for her?" Running Bear asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tom nodded once, a simple gesture that carried the weight of a promise. Then, without a word, he gently took the bundle from Running Bear's arms. The baby seemed impossibly small in his large hands, but he held her with a tenderness that surprised everyone watching. Running Bear stood there for a moment, looking at his daughter one last time. He whispered something in Apache, a blessing, perhaps, or a goodbye, then turned and walked away without looking back. The crowd watched him go, understanding that they had witnessed something that would change all their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Tom looked down at the baby in his arms. Her crying had stopped, and she was looking up at him with those dark, curious eyes. In that moment, something shifted inside him, something he thought had been buried forever, beneath years of solitude and silence. "What's her name?" Kenzie asked quietly. Tom looked up, realizing that Running Bear hadn't told them. He thought for a moment, then spoke in his deep, rarely used voice. "Hope." The name seemed to hang in the desert air like a prayer. The first night was the hardest. Tom had rented a small room above Mackenzie's trading post, and as darkness fell over the desert, he found himself staring at the tiny bundle on the bed, completely unsure of what to do next. The baby Hope had been quiet during the day, but as the temperature dropped and hunger set in, she began to cry again. Tom had faced down grizzly bears, survived blizzards that would kill lesser men, and worked in conditions that would break most people's spirits, but nothing had prepared him for the helpless wail of a hungry infant. He paced the small room, gently rocking her, trying to remember if he'd ever seen anyone care for a baby before. His own childhood had been cut short when he was barely 10 years old, thrust into adult responsibilities when his parents died in a house fire. He'd been on his own ever since, never staying in one place long enough to form the kinds of relationships that might have taught him about family life. Now, at 35, he was completely out of his depth. Mackenzie's wife, Martha, knocked on his door around midnight. She was a kind woman who had raised 5 children of her own. The sound of the baby's crying had drawn her upstairs despite her husband's warnings about not getting involved. "Need some milk," Martha said simply, taking Hope from Tom's exhausted arms, "and she needs it warm." For the next hour, Martha taught Tom the basics of infant care. She showed him how to warm cow's milk to the right temperature, how to fashion a feeding bottle from a jar and a piece of cloth, and how to hold the baby so she could eat without choking. She also taught him how to change the makeshift diapers, and how to tell when Hope was uncomfortable. "Babies need routine," Martha explained, as Hope finally settled into sleep. "They need to know they're safe, that food will come when they're hungry, that someone will be there when they cry." Tom absorbed every word, his analytical mind, trained by years of calculating timber loads and weather patterns, now focused entirely on this new responsibility. He asked questions in his quiet way, storing away each piece of information like it was the most important thing he'd ever learned. Why did you do it? Martha asked as she prepared to leave. Take her, I mean. You don't seem like the type for... ... Well, for this. Tom was quiet for a long time, looking down at Hope's sleeping face. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Martha had ever heard it. I know what it's like to be unwanted. Over the next few days, Tom postponed his departure to the logging camp, sending word that he'd been delayed by personal business. He spent his time learning to care for Hope. Guided by Martha's patient instruction and his own growing determination to do right by this child who had been placed in his care, that the townspeople watched this unlikely pairing with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Tom Harrison, the silent giant who had never shown interest in anything beyond his work, was now seen walking through town with a baby cradled carefully in his arms. He would stop at the general store for supplies, at the doctor's office for advice, and at the church where the pastor's wife had offered to help with sewing clothes that would fit Hope properly. Never seen anything like it, Mackenzie told his wife one evening. Man barely says 2 words in a week, but I watched him spend an hour today asking Doc Peterson about infant nutrition, taking notes like his life depended on it. And what the townspeople didn't see were the quiet moments in Tom's room above the trading post. They didn't see him sitting by the window in the early morning hours, watching Hope sleep while he planned out their future. They didn't see him talking to her in his low, gentle voice, telling her stories about the places he'd been and the things he'd seen, as if his words could somehow make up for the family she'd lost. Your daddy made a hard choice, he would whisper to her, but it was the right choice. You're going to have a good life, little one, I promise you that. Tom had always been a man of action rather than words, but Hope seemed to be changing that too. He found himself speaking to her throughout the day, narrating his activities, sharing his thoughts, and making plans out loud. It was as if her presence had unlocked something in him that had been silent for too long. By the end of the first week, Tom had made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He wasn't going to the logging camp in Montana. Instead, he was going to find a place where he could settle down, where Hope could grow up with stability and community around her. He approached Mackenzie with a proposition. I hear there's good timberland for sale up north of here, near Prescott. A man could make a decent living if he had his own operation. Mackenzie nodded. That's true enough. It takes capital to start your own logging business. Equipment, land, workers. Tom had been thinking about that too. He'd saved his money carefully over the years, living simply and spending little. Combined with what he could get for his equipment and the settlement he'd received from a logging company after an accident had nearly crippled his left arm, he had enough to make a start. I've got the money, Tom said. What I need is advice. You know the territory, know the people. Could you help me figure out what I need to do? Mackenzie studied Tom's face, seeing a determination there that hadn't been present before. This is about the baby, isn't it? You're not just changing jobs, you're changing your whole life. Tom glanced upstairs, where Hope was napping under. Martha's watchful care. A man's got to think about more than just himself when he's got a daughter to raise. The word came out naturally, without hesitation. Daughter, in just 1 week. Tom had gone from being a solitary drifter to a man with family responsibilities, and the transformation seemed to suit him in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. Over the next few days, Tom threw himself into planning with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. He studied maps, talked to local ranchers about timber needs, and calculated costs and potential profits. But he also spent time thinking about less tangible things, like what kind of community he wanted Hope to grow up in, and what kind of man he needed to become to be worthy of being called her father. Martha noticed the change in him during one of their daily discussions about Hope's care. You're different, she observed. More... present. Like you found something you didn't. No, you were looking for. Tom considered her words while feeding Hope her evening bottle. The baby looked up at him with those dark, trusting eyes, and he felt again that strange sensation of something shifting inside his chest. Maybe I was looking for something, he admitted. I just didn't know what it was until I found it. As the second week came to an end, Tom finalized his plans. He'd found a piece of land near Prescott that included both timber rights and a small cabin that could serve as a temporary home while he built something more permanent. The previous owner had died, and his widow was eager to sell to someone who would work the land rather than just hold it for speculation. The night before, they were set to leave. Tom sat by the window with hope in his arms, looking out at the desert that had brought them together. Tomorrow, they would begin their new life together. A silent man who had found his voice, an abandoned baby who had found her family. "We're going home, Hope," he whispered to her as she drifted off to sleep. Our home. For the first time in his adult life, Tom Harrison had somewhere to belong. The journey to Prescott took 3 days by wagon, and Tom quickly learned that traveling with a baby required careful planning and infinite patience. Hope was a generally content child, but the constant motion, changing temperatures, and disrupted feeding schedule made her fussy in ways that tested Tom's new parenting skills. On the first night, camped under a canopy of desert stars, Tom sat by the fire holding Hope while she cried inconsolably. Nothing he tried seemed to help, not feeding, not changing her diaper, not rocking or walking or singing the half-remembered lullabies from his own childhood. He was beginning to panic when an elderly Mexican woman approached their camp. "Puedo ayudar?" she asked, gesturing toward the crying baby. Tom didn't speak Spanish, but her meaning was clear enough. Desperate, he nodded. The woman who introduced herself as Señora Valdez took Hope with practiced ease. Within minutes, she had the baby calm and settled. Through a mixture of broken English and gestures, she explained that Hope was overstimulated from the journey and needed to be swaddled more tightly and kept in a quieter environment. "Bibi necesita paz," she said, wrapping Hope snugly in Tom's spare shirt. "Peace. Quiet like mother's womb." Señora Valdez was traveling with her own family to visit relatives in Prescott, and she rode alongside Tom's wagon for the remaining 2 days, sharing her wisdom about infant care and serving as an unexpected bridge between Tom's inexperience and Hope's needs. By the time they reached their destination, Tom had learned valuable lessons about patience, observation, and the importance of staying calm when caring for a child. The property Tom had purchased was more isolated than he had expected. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a creek running nearby and mountains visible in the distance. It was beautiful in its wilderness way, but it was also clearly the home of a man who had lived alone for many years. The single room was sparsely furnished, with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table, and a bed that had seen better days. Tom's first priority was making the space suitable for Hope. He built a small crib from pine boards, sanding the wood smooth, so there would be no splinters to hurt her delicate skin. He hung blankets to create a separate sleeping area that would be quieter and more private. He also constructed a changing table at a height that wouldn't strain his back during the frequent diaper changes that had become a major part of his daily routine. The work felt different than any construction project he'd ever undertaken. Usually he built things to be functional and durable, but for Hope, he found himself paying attention to details that had never mattered before. He carved small animals, from wood scraps to hang above her crib. He made sure the windows were positioned so she could see outside, but wouldn't be hit by direct sunlight. He even built a small rocking chair where he could sit with her in the evenings. As autumn settled over the mountains, Tom established routines that worked for both of them. He would wake before dawn to tend to Hope's needs, then spend the morning hours cutting timber while she napped in a basket he'd fashioned to keep her safe and comfortable outdoors. In the afternoons, he would work on improving their cabin or maintaining his equipment while Hope lay on a blanket nearby, watching the play of light through the trees, the isolation that had once been comfortable for. Tom now felt like a potential problem. Hope needed interaction with other people, needed to learn how to be part of a community rather than just living in the wilderness with a single caretaker. But the nearest neighbors were miles away, and trips to town were major undertakings that required careful planning. Tom's solution was to make those trips count. Every 2 weeks, he would load Hope into the wagon and drive to Prescott for supplies, but he would also make sure to visit with the townspeople. To let Hope be around other voices and faces became a regular at the church. Not because he was particularly religious, because it was one of the few places where families gathered and children played. The pastor's wife, Mrs. Coleman, took a special interest in Hope. She was a motherly woman who had raised 7 children of her own, and she could see that Tom was doing his best but needed guidance in ways he might not even recognize. "She needs other children around her," Mrs. Coleman told Tom one Sunday after church. "Babies learn by watching and imitating. She only sees you, she only learn your ways." Tom understood the wisdom in her words, but the practical application was challenging. "There aren't many children where we live," he admitted. "And the ones in town, their parents might not want them around an Apache baby." Mrs. Coleman's face grew stern. "Then their parents are fools. This child is a blessing, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be around her anyway." Her words were fierce and protective, and Tom felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had chosen to see Hope as simply a child in need of love rather than as something to be feared or pitied. It was Mrs. Coleman who suggested that Tom bring Hope to the church's weekly gatherings where she could play with other children and learn the social skills she would need as she grew older. These visits became a highlight of both Tom's and Hope's weeks. Hope would light up when she saw the other children reaching for them with chubby hands and babbling in response to their chatter. Tom would find himself surrounded by parents who gradually warmed to his quiet presence and obvious devotion to his daughter. "Never seen a man so attentive to a baby," commented John Morrison, whose own wife had died, leaving him with 3 young children. "You've got the patience of a saint." Tom didn't feel particularly saintly. Most of the time he felt like he was stumbling through parenthood, making it up as he went along and hoping he wasn't doing too much damage. But he was learning to trust his instincts, to pay attention to Hope's cues, and to adapt when something wasn't working. Winter in the mountains was harsh. Tom worried about keeping Hope healthy and comfortable during the long, cold months. He chinked every gap in the cabin walls, laid in supplies of food and medicine, and made sure they had enough firewood to last until spring. He also spent the long evenings teaching himself to read more fluently, using the few books he'd acquired and reading aloud to Hope, who seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice even when she couldn't understand the words. It was during one of these winter evenings that Tom realized how completely his life had changed. He was sitting by the fire with Hope on his lap, reading from a collection of fairy tales that Mrs. Coleman had given him. Hope was almost a year old now, sitting up on her own and beginning to say simple words like Baba for bottle and Dada for Tom. "Dada," she said, looking up at him with those bright, curious eyes that had grown more beautiful with each passing month. Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had never expected to be anyone's Dada, had never imagined that such a simple word could carry such weight of love and responsibility and joy. In that moment, sitting in their warm cabin with snow falling outside and his daughter chattering contentedly in his arms, Tom Harrison knew that he had found the purpose that had been missing from his life. "That's right, little one," he whispered, kissing the top of her dark head. "I'm your Dada, and you're my Hope. And we're going to take care of each other, no matter what." Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, but inside their small cabin, Tom and Hope were safe and warm, and together. They had built more than just a home in the wilderness. They had built a family by Hope's 2nd birthday. She had grown into a bright, energetic toddler who filled their mountain cabin with laughter and chatter. She spoke in a mixture of English, words and sounds that seemed to come from some deeper, instinctual place. And Tom often wondered if she was remembering fragments of her Apache heritage. He encouraged this, wanting her to understand that she came from 2 worlds and belonged fully to both. Their life had settled into comfortable routines. Tom's logging business was prospering as more settlers moved to the territory in demand. For lumber grew, and hired 2 local men to help with the heavy work, which meant he could spend more time at home with Hope while still providing well for their needs. The little girl had become the center of his world, and everyone who knew them could see the profound bond between the silent lumberjack and his adopted daughter. But they're peaceful. Existence was about to face its greatest challenge. It started with a stranger asking questions in town, a thin man in a dark suit who claimed to be from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, inquiring about Apache children who might have been separated from their families. Pastor Coleman's wife mentioned it too. Tom, during one of their Sunday visits, her voice worried. He was asking specifically about a baby girl, about 2 years old, who might have been adopted by a white family, she said quietly, glancing at Hope, who was playing with the other children nearby. Tom, I think he might be looking for Hope, Tom. Felt his blood run cold. He'd always known this day might come. Had worried about it during sleepless nights when Hope was sick or upset. Legally, he had no claim to her. There had been no formal adoption, no papers filed, nothing that would stand up in court if someone challenged his right to raise her. "What did you tell him?" Tom asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Nothing," Mrs. Coleman said firmly. "Others might not be so protective. You need to be prepared." That night, Tom sat by Hope's bed, watching her sleep, his mind racing with possibilities. He could take her and run, disappear into the wilderness where no government official would find them. He had the skills to live off the land, to keep them, both safe and hidden. But what kind of life would that be for a little girl who needed stability, education, and community? He could also stand and fight, hire a lawyer, and argue that he had been caring for Hope for nearly 2 years, that he was the only father she had ever known. But the law was rarely kind to white men who adopted Indian children, especially when government officials decided that those children belonged in special schools designed to civilize them. The decision was taken out of his hands 3 days. Later, when the man in the dark suit appeared at their cabin, accompanied by a federal marshal and a woman who introduced herself as a representative from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. "Mr. Harrison," the government man said, his voice formal and cold, "I'm Agent Whitman from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have reason to believe you are harboring an Apache child who should be in federal custody." Tom stepped out onto his porch, closing the door behind him so Hope wouldn't see the strangers. "She's my daughter," he said simply. "She's an Indian ward of the federal government," Agent Whitman replied. "And according to our records, she should have been placed in an appropriate educational facility years ago. The Carlisle School has programs specifically designed to help children like her integrate into civilized society." "She is integrated," Tom said, his voice growing harder. "She's happy, healthy, and loved. She doesn't need your school." The woman from Carlisle stepped forward. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your attachment to the child, but you must think of what's best for her future. At Carlisle, she'll receive proper education, learn useful trades, and be prepared to take her place in modern American society. Here, isolated in the wilderness with no other children around, she's being deprived of opportunities that could transform her life." Tom wanted to tell them about Hope's visits to town, about her friends at church, about the books he read to her every night, and the letters he was teaching her to recognize. He wanted to explain that she was learning about both her Apache heritage and her place in the broader world, that she was growing up secure in the knowledge that she was loved and wanted. But he could see in their faces that none of that would matter. They had come with legal authority and predetermined ideas about what was best for Indian children, and nothing he said would change their minds. "I have papers," Agent Whitman continued, pulling documents from his briefcase. "Federal custody orders that supersede any local arrangements. The child will come with us today," No, Tom said, the word coming out harder and more final than he had intended. The marshal stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Now, Mr. Harrison, there's no need to make this difficult. The law is the law." Tom stood his ground, his massive frame blocking the doorway to his home. Inside, he could hear Hope playing with her wooden toys, humming a little song he had taught her. The sound of her innocent happiness in the face of this threat made something fierce and protective rise up in his chest. "She stays with me," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that made even the marshal pause. Agent Whitman sighed with bureaucratic impatience. "Mr. Harrison, you're forcing us to take actions none of us want to take. If you interfere with federal officers in the performance of their duties, you'll be arrested. Is that really what you want? To leave the child completely alone while you sit in jail?" The threat was clear, and Tom knew they meant it. He also knew that if he were arrested, there would be no one to protect Hope, no one to ensure she was treated gently during the transition they were forcing on her. His mind raced, looking for options, for some way to keep his promise to always take care of her. That's when Hope herself solved the immediate problem. The cabin door opened, and she appeared beside Tom, looking up at the strangers with curious but unafraid eyes. She had grown into a beautiful child, with her Apache features softened by good nutrition and constant love, her dark hair shining and her clothes clean and well-made. "Dada," she said, reaching up for Tom to pick her up. "Who are the people?" Tom lifted her into his arms, feeling her small body relax against his chest with complete trust. "These people want to take you away from Dada," he said gently, knowing that honesty was important, even in this terrible moment. Hope's face clouded with confusion. "Don't want to go away from Dada." The woman from Carlisle stepped forward with a practiced smile. "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Miss Patterson. We're here to take you to a wonderful school where you'll learn so many new things and make lots of friends." "I have friends," Hope said, clinging more tightly to Tom. "At church, and Mrs. Coleman gives me cookies." Agent Whitman was growing impatient. "Mr. Harrison, you're only making this harder on the child. The longer you delay, the more traumatic this becomes for her." Tom looked down at Hope's trusting face, then back at the officials who had come to tear apart his world. He made a decision that would require every ounce of strength he had ever possessed. "If she has to go," he said slowly, "then I'm coming too." The three officials exchanged surprised glances. "I'm sorry," Agent Whitman said. "Carlisle needs teachers, doesn't it? Skilled tradesmen to teach the children useful work?" Tom's mind was working furiously, remembering conversations he'd had with traveling salesmen and other visitors who had talked about the Indian schools. "I'm an experienced carpenter and logger. I could teach woodworking, construction, practical skills."
Oh.
Miss Patterson looked intrigued despite herself. "The school does employ white staff to provide instruction in industrial arts." "Then that's what I'll do," Tom said firmly. "If Hope has to go to your school, then I'll work there. She won't have to be completely separated from the only family she's known." Agent Whitman frowned. "That's highly irregular. The whole point of the educational process is to help these children move beyond their previous associations." "The point," Tom interrupted with more force than he usually showed, "should be to help children grow up healthy and confident. Hope needs stability. If you're determined to disrupt her life, then at least let me help her through the transition." The marshal spoke up for the first time. "Actually, Agent Whitman, it might not be a bad solution. School's always short-staffed, and if the man's willing to work for government wages, it saves the Bureau money." After a long discussion that Hope didn't understand, but that she sensed was important, the officials agreed to Tom's proposal. He would be allowed to apply for a position at Carlisle, and if accepted, he could accompany Hope to the school. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than complete separation, as they prepared for the journey that would take them away from there. Mountain home, Tom packed carefully, including Hope's favorite toys, the books he had read to her, and a small wooden horse he had carved for her first birthday. He also wrote a letter to Mrs. Coleman, asking her to look after their cabin and explaining what had happened. "Will we come back, Dada?" Hope asked, as Tom loaded their belongings into the government wagon. Tom knelt down beside her, taking her small hands in his large ones. "I don't know, little one, but I promise you, this wherever we go, we'll be together. You're my daughter, and nothing will ever change that." Hope nodded solemnly, trusting him completely, even though she couldn't understand the full implications of what was happening. As their wagon pulled away from the cabin that had been their home, Tom made a silent vow that he would find a way to protect her spirit and her identity. Even in an institution designed to erase both, the test of their love was just beginning. But Tom Harrison had already proven that there was nothing he wouldn't do for his daughter. The road ahead would be difficult, but they would travel it together.